Good afternoon and welcome to Day 3 of the Summer 2010 EDEF Educational Research course. Again, my name is Greg Sherman. I'm the facilitator of the course here from the home office at Radford University. And the purpose of this particular short video is to introduce you to the first text readings that you have assigned. This is not the readings from the Willingham book. Those readings, hopefully you had a chance to already complete those. It goes pretty quick. If you haven't, don't worry, you certainly have time. But I also want you to take the time to discuss the answers to the discussion questions with your team members. It'll just make the whole experience more meaningful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the discussions at the end of this presentation. But without further ado, I would like to present you with a few basic slides and some information that will hopefully tie together chapters 1, 23, and 3, at least the assigned pages, in the course text, and will make it more meaningful and relevant to you as you process the material and get ready to take a quiz over the outcomes linked to the material, and that quiz is due by Saturday evening. So with that, let's take a look at some more details regarding those chapters. First reading quiz for this summer session is going to focus on 3 chapters from the Franklin Wallen book, and these 3 chapters align very well with trying to wrap your head around the research project, the research proposal project that is due at the end of these 5 weeks. These 3 chapters focus on number 1, the nature of research, and then more specifically mixed methods research, and finally the beginning of research design is presented in chapter 3 on variables and hypotheses. These 3 chapters were selected for the first readings for the course because they really help set the stage for the research proposal that is presented as part of the research project for the course, and this proposal was published by the Institute of Education Sciences. It has been altered and doctored to meet the needs of this class, but the nature of that proposal represents something that's actually very real. And as I indicated earlier, this is an example of a professional development experience that could be very useful not only for teachers learning more about research, but also if a proposal like this could get funded, then the school district that you would be working for would benefit tremendously, as would its students. We're going to begin by looking at some of the information from the first chapter on the nature of research, and one of the things that's important to consider when you're beginning to read the information in chapter 1 is the fact that this chapter focuses on the teacher as a researcher. And as you know, a teacher assumes many different roles in his or her job. One role, very obviously, is the role of the artist, where the teacher does a lot of creating instructional experiences, creating solutions, and that sort of thing. A teacher, of course, also thinks and works as a counselor, interacting with students as well as colleagues, and trying to help them find solutions to some of their personal or interpersonal problems. A teacher also spends a good part of his or her time acting as a leader in some capacity, and a teacher also acts as a scientist in some ways, and that is going to be the focus of this particular chapter. Finally, one of the roles, and this certainly doesn't constitute all of them, but perhaps one of the most important, is teacher as the role of parent or nurturer in some ways. And this is something that a good teacher certainly can't escape and wouldn't. But these are the roles, some of the roles that a teacher plays, but it's important to consider that in chapter 1 we're going to examine teachers as researchers and not focus so much on the other roles. And it's also important to remember that that this is a mad scientist, but there are other ways to portray certainly a scientist in general. You could be a pretty scientist if you want, or you can be an adventurous scientist investigating adventurous things like ancient artifacts or the possibility of life out there in the universe. Page 10 of Chapter 1 looks at and investigates science as a very important way of knowing. And when you put this in the context of what it means to be a teacher, I think the information presented in Chapter 1 makes sense. It makes sense to look at a research course as something that could help improve the professional practice as a teacher. And here's an example. One way of knowing is simply to sense. And in chapter 1 and on page 10, they have a picture of somebody sensing their environment, sensing that something is hot. But in light of being a teacher, let's pretend for a minute that you were a teacher and you presented a lesson or facilitated a lesson, and at the end of the lesson, if you were a good teacher, you said to yourself, was that effective or was it not effective? Well, one of the things you might say to yourself is simply that I think this was a good lesson. Just to have a sense of it, to sense that, based on a lot of different variables that might or might not be a scientific interpretation, but you might just have a feeling. And sensing something is a way of knowing. Also, sharing information with others is a way of knowing. If a student came up to you after your excellent lesson on rock history, and that's the history of rock and roll, not the history of igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary rocks. But if a student came up to you and said that they thought that lesson was awesome, that's certainly a way of knowing, because it's somebody sharing information with you. If you were unlucky enough to have Albert Einstein as your university supervisor when you were doing your math student teaching placement, then you might have gotten some feedback or information from an expert, and that's another way of knowing. You can read articles from experts or listen to experts on television or the radio, and that's certainly a way of knowing that people use to help make sense of their environment. People also use their own logical reasoning as a way of knowing something. If you were doing a lesson on solar power and you realized that on that particular day there were more than the usual number of vampires in attendance, then you might say to yourself, just using logical reasoning, that there really were too many vampires in class for your solar power lesson to be effective. And again, just simple logical reasoning. And finally, there is a scientific way of knowing. And one example of that would be to examine some actual data related to a lesson that you facilitated, and you could say to yourself, you know, based on these data, my lesson was not successful enough, or it wasn't as successful as I wanted it to be. And that's one of the important points that is made in Chapter 1, is that science is a way of knowing. And then we jump all the way to Chapter 23, where, first of all, it is reinforced that research is science. So doing research according to the methods that are acceptable for that research, you are in fact doing science. Now, Chapter 23 focuses on mixed methods research design, and that includes both qualitative data, the data or designs that might include designs focused on interpersonal interactions, or quantitative methodologies that focus on the collection, the quantification, that is turning into numbers, and the analysis of those numbers, both of which are science. And the reason why they're presented immediately in chapter at the beginning of the class is that the research proposal that you are asked to develop, the project, is going to ask you to develop a mixed method design. And so I want you to keep that in mind as you read through the subsequent chapter assignments for this particular class.